Welcome to Boys Town's micro lesson on effective consequences. Whenever we think of consequences, our thoughts tend to drift to negative consequences. However, consequences can be positive as well. Today, we will talk about how to use effective consequences so that students are more likely to choose positive behaviors by reinforcing with positive consequences as opposed to choosing negative behaviors and punishing with negative consequences. Considering appropriate consequences ahead of time can help us avoid using consequences that aren't realistic, like your toys are all going in the trash, or too difficult to follow through with, you're grounded for a year. The goal of this lesson is to define consequences, to identify and use appropriate positive and negative consequences, and to gain an understanding of the characteristics of effective consequences. Consequences are anything that follows a behavior and affects whether the behavior occurs again. Consequences help children learn that their actions lead to results, both positive and negative. Consequences teach children that life is full of choices and the choices they make greatly influence what happens to them. Consequences should be fair and predictable. To reach this goal, it's helpful to have a predetermined bank of positive and negative consequences as possible choices. When we don't have options to choose from, it is easy to get creative in the moment. This creativity may result in a consequence that may be too big or too small or may not directly relate to the behavior. There may be times when students aren't clear about the possible outcomes of their behavior. Posting these possible consequences, both positive and negative, in the classroom provides students more information. When students understand possible outcomes, it may help them to choose more positive behaviors and avoid negative behaviors. When the teacher selects the consequence from these choices, it can create predictability and fairness in the classroom. It is important to note that behaviors may occur in which additional consequences that aren't posted may be used. Being transparent and clearly explaining the use of additional or different consequences to students may be necessary. It is also important to note that when consequences are used, it will be important that students' rights are not violated. Your school and district administrators can identify those consequences that might violate student rights. Positive consequences are things that we like and are generally willing to work for. When positive consequences follow a behavior, that behavior is more likely to happen more often in the future. A positive consequence for an adult might be a paycheck. Earning a paycheck may make it more likely attendance is good at work and work is completed at a higher quality. A positive consequence for a child may be earning an extra story at bedtime when they're helpful around the house. Earning that extra story may make it more likely that the child will continue to be helpful. Think of positive consequences as rewards or privileges. Also take into consideration that there may be natural or logical consequences occurring as well. Pointing out those natural or logical consequences may be more meaningful than a child earning an artificial consequence such as a reward or privilege. Avoid providing consequences that relate to academic tasks. Consider adding more logical and natural consequences. Some classroom examples might be choosing their own seat in class, bonus points on homework, computer time, teacher helper for the day, lunch with a favorite teacher, using headphones during work time, positive message home, buy back a bad grade by redoing an assignment or quiz, or anything else that you can think of that motivates a particular student. Negative consequences are things that we generally do not like, and we will work to avoid. When negative consequences follow a behavior, that behavior will generally decrease in the future. An example of a negative consequence for an adult is a speeding ticket. The negative consequence tends to decrease the number of times we go faster than the speed limit. Another example would be a child who hurt their sibling. The parent has them complete the sibling's chores. Adding a chore is the negative consequence, and the behavior of hurting the sibling will be less likely in the future. Now let's look at some types of negative consequences. Remove a privilege, redo an assignment, a timeout, detention, classroom chore, shortened recess, changing seats, parent conference, or private teacher conversation. Sometimes just the act of correction may be enough for some students. Effective consequences are individualized. What works for one student may not work for others. Consequences must be immediate and should happen as soon as possible after the behavior occurs. They should be proportional in size, meaning the amount of the consequences should fit the behavior. There is no need to use a cannon to kill a fly when a fly swatter will do. Consequences should be contingent on the behavior and should only be given if the behaviors occur. For example, don't use a group consequence when not every student earned that consequence. Consequences should also be natural or logical. An example of a natural consequence could be touching a hot stove and getting burnt. An example of a logical consequence might be a student misusing scissors will have the scissors taken away for the remainder of the day. Lastly, consequences should be varied to avoid deprivation and satiation. Overusing the same positive or negative consequence with the same student could lead the student to learn to live without that particular privilege or item, or lead them to be bored with the consequence, making it ineffective. When consequences occur consistently and systematically, they either encourage or discourage behavior, making them a powerful tool for changing behavior. Ineffective consequences occur when they are not planned. Other reasons consequences fail is inconsistency in using consequences, or lack of enforcement of the consequence. Or it isn't the right consequence for that individual or that particular situation. Sometimes the consequence isn't given the time to work before giving up or switching to a different consequence. Lastly, consequences don't work if there are too many negatives and not enough positives. Too often, when we think of consequences, we think in terms of punishment for bad behavior, rather than using consequences as an opportunity to reinforce positive behaviors. Rather than waiting for bad behavior to issue consequences, we should seek opportunities to catch them being good and use consequences to reinforce this positive behavior frequently. Boys Town recommends a 4-to-1 ratio, so 4 positives for every 1 negative. Use positives and negative consequences to affect future behavior. Remember to start small. Use consequences as immediately as possible as a response to a behavior. We don't use positive consequences before the positive behavior to bribe the desired behavior out of a student, so to speak, but to respond to the student's use of a positive behavior. For more ideas, for examples, lesson plans, etc., please visit the National Training website.